do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Ms. Haronga.
Tēnā koutou e te komehana. If I can call the next witness, Aaron Edward Smale.
Please do that.
Mr. Chair, if you would.
Good afternoon, Mr. Smale. Do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Ms. Haronga.
Mr. Smale, some formalities for the beginning. If you look in front of you, there should be a statement. Can you confirm that's the statement you prepared and signed for the purpose of this hearing?
Yes, I can.
Is there also a folder of relevant documents referred to in that written statement before you?
Yes.
And do you formally produce that collection of documents for the Commission's consideration?
Yes, I do.
Can you please introduce yourself, including any acknowledgements you would like to make at the outset, particularly in relation to the stories contained in those documents?
Kia ora, my name's Aaron Edward Smale. Ko Waiapu te awa, ko Ikurangi te maunga, ko Ngāti Parau te iwi, ko tūwhakahiri ora te whanau o tūwhakahiri ora rawa ko rua taupure te hapu. I'd just like to acknowledge the Commissioners. Kia ora. Kia ora koutou. I'd also like to acknowledge, as a journalist, my evidence is largely based on the kōrero, the conversations I've had with other people, and particularly survivors. And there's a couple of them who are here today and other survivors that I would like to acknowledge. Jimmy McLaughlin is here, Tyrone Marks is here, Kath, Greg, Rangi's here somewhere, Kararaina, Tony. I'd just like to acknowledge them. Albie Epity was hoping to be here, he's been unable to make it. I'd just like to acknowledge them because my coverage of this issue would not have been possible without conversations with them and many others. And I think I would like to emphasise that the power of their stories has been I think anyway, one of the major factors in getting this inquiry to happen. I'd like to also acknowledge some of the previous witnesses who gave evidence: Moana Jackson, Alison Green, Keith Whiffen, Judge Henwood, and particularly today Oliver Sutherland and Sir Kim Wegman. I'd just like to acknowledge these people because they've, as you heard, been talking about this issue and fighting for this issue for, in some cases, longer than I've been around. So this is how long it goes back. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Aaron. By way of a deeper introduction, you've outlined your whakapapa, but you also have a personal story in relation to state intervention in your early childhood. Insofar as you want to share it today, are you able to talk to us a bit about your early childhood?
Yeah, it's good. Some water.
Take your time.
Yeah, I was born in 1971. My birth father, for want of a better term, is Māori. His mother was Kumeroa Tāwhara from Ngāti Parau. She also had Ngā Pui and Whakatoa here, Whakapapa. My grandfather had, I believe, Ngāti te aroa whakapapa. And then on my birth mother was Pākehā, Irish, Scandinavian, English. And that relationship was practically over, I suppose, by the time I was born. And so in 1971, as you've heard from Alison and others, adoption was kind of, I won't say the only option, but it was the main option that young teenage single mothers without any means to support themselves, that was the option that was kind of, signed here. And I will come back to this, but and Alison has already referred to it, the whole ranking of children in that adoption system. And in the late 1960s, early 70s, there was an oversupply, if you like, and which meant that the predominantly Pākehā couples, middle-class couples that were lining up to adopt, got to pick and choose, if you like. And there was a process whereby they would be interviewed and their preferences, or in terms of what kind of child they wanted, would be noted. And supply and demand kind of dictated that the children that were least wanted were Māori boys. And as I didn't know this until some years later, and I'll come back to how I came across that information. It was actually from Ann Ells. It's in my statement anyway, written statement. Now, that had some impacts on how my adoption scenario played out, if you like. And one of the, as I found out again, like years later, the Adoption Act actually excludes traditional Māori adoptions. And by way of contrast, there's a number of, or several anyway, members of my whānau, where older members, where they were whānau'd within the wider family members. The word whāngai is often used interchangeably with adoption. What it actually means is to feed or nurture, which I think is actually quite a beautiful term. So because the Adoption Act excluded that option, it meant that, yes, my birth mother and father had their differences and had gone their separate ways, and I won't go into their personal details. But as I've tried to explain to my birth mother, what that meant was that the option of my wider whānau stepping in and taking responsibility for my upbringing, that option was taken out of the picture. I'll fast forward. A couple by the name of Jim and Tina Smale, and you might have to forgive me here if I get a little bit emotional. My adoptive mother, Tina, passed away in April, and so a lot of the issues around my adoption have I've had to sort of revisit them. But they were a share milking couple, didn't have a particularly good education, and I wonder whether that meant that they were ranked in some way as well. And but they were open to adopting a Māori child, and so they and were told, I think, that it would mean that they would jump the queue, if you like, because there was more Māori babies available. And they got a phone call that there was this child in the Hutt Valley. They were in the Bay of Plenty. They drove down. A nurse met them at the hospital waiting room, was carrying me, dropped me in Mum's lap. Mum had no experience of newborns. This nurse went away, came back 5-10 minutes later and said, well, do you want them or not? And Mum always told that story with a note of disgust of the sort of callous way that it was carried out. And but I was fortunate. I was very fortunate that as a couple they were, the best parents I could have asked for, really. And they gave me everything they could. But as I grew up, they understood and realised that they couldn't give me my identity, to the extent that my father said a couple of years ago, you should never have been taken from your family. And I took that, it was actually a relief in some ways. I took that as he meant it, and I don't think for a minute that he meant that he didn't want me. I just think he'd always had my best interests at heart, and he could see the damage it had done to both myself and my other sister, who was adopted. So, sorry to be a bit long-winded about this, but it actually, my personal journey has been quite influential into my professional work, so I'll sort of bear with me here a bit. But so that, growing up, knowing I was Māori, had very minimal information, but not having any information about that, I can remember being upset about that from a very young age and struggling with that. And as Alison's referred to, you know, I concur with much of her experience. As I said, my parents tried to give me everything they can in terms of my identity, and part of it was they sent me to St. Stephen's. Unfortunately, that only underlined my sort of lack of identity and alienation, because many of the other guys, you know, had mates that were tūhoe, they were tūturu, you know, they had their language, everything, they knew who they were. And, you know, and being from the Bay of Plenty, you know, a lot of the guys were the same. And the other aspect of St. Stephen's that wasn't great was it was quite a violent place. You know, I could tell a few examples. I mean, I've got a scar over my left eye from being stitched up after a brawl. I got visited in the middle of the night with by two guys that beat me up in bed. You know, and there's a number of other occasions. We used to have a term, walking the dawn. You walk down the line, and seniors could have a crack at you, and they did. One of the individuals that did have a crack at me was a guy that ended up later convicted for murder. I can't say I was surprised. So that was on top of my kind of lack of identity. It's you know, by the time I hit 16, I had a few things I was struggling with. I met my birth parents at that time, and yeah, that was, I won't go into the detail of that, but it was quite a significant day when my birth father told me I was Ngāti Porou. It was like a physical cloak of presence being put on me. And so that's kind of, I guess, my backstory. In terms of my work as a journalist, I had a bit of a knack for writing and an irritating habit of asking annoying questions. And so I ended up in that career. I'd just like to note that, yes, journalism is a job description, the media is an industry, but I'd like to sort of put it in a little bit of a wider context, that it's of what I call, I suppose, is one term I could use, is the public conversation. Because as somebody who works in the media, but somebody who's Māori, there's often a bit of a tension there. And we've heard from a number of very impressive witnesses about institutional racism. I'd just like to touch on, I guess, what I regard as the institutional racism in journalism. That's a subject all on its own that there's not the space to canvass here, but...
And just remember the stenographer and our sign interpreters as well.
Okay.
But please continue.
I'll have a drink while I give you guys time to calm down. From my point of view, if you look at, in terms of the public conversation and the role the media plays in that, if you look at the media and then you look at politicians, they're doing quite a similar thing, because what they're trying to do is reach the biggest number of people, the biggest audience. That's just politics, it's just business, you could say. But what that tends to happen is that the biggest audience, the biggest market, the biggest electorate is white middle class Pākehā. And so political messaging, journalistic coverage of any issue even when it relates to Māori, and particularly when it relates to Māori or other ethnicities, is always filtered through that lens. And yeah, I just think that that's worth just noting that here, because some of my coverage will wrestles with that question. And I think it's notable. I mean, you've heard from Oliver Sullivan, and this issue has been out there for a long time. And some people will talk about me breaking the story. And, you know, well done, Aaron, you broke the story. Well, I find that kind of embarrassing, because it's been in hiding in plain sight for decades, as we've heard. And I've kind of scratched my head at times and wondered, well, why hasn't it got the traction 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago? Because there's been a number of very great individuals who have fought this cause long before I came along. And there's been journalistic coverage of it as well. So that's, I guess, a little bit about my backgrounds. I'm not sure I can talk next about the, I guess, the stories that are directly relevant to this topic.
That's right, and also, as you'll recall, your brief is taken as read, so the Commission does have records of the places where you worked. But why don't we fast forward and you look at the category of investigative work that you did focusing on survivor stories, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the lead up to the article, Justice Delayed, Justice Denied.
Yeah.
Perhaps focusing first on the research and the investigative work through the experts, and also highlighting the survivor story there. Sure.
Just a little preface to that. Just on the adoption issue again, I found a sister I didn't know about 10 years ago, and that raised that whole question again, is how did this happen? How did I miss out on this person? And I think you're hearing from Anne Ellis, I believe, and yeah, she canvasses that subject of Māori boys that I've already touched on, and that really raised some quite painful questions actually initially, as to what was wrong with Māori boys? We were only just born, you know? Is there something kind of, are we some kind of less human? And Moana's testimony yesterday was about the colonialism being about another group of people being inherently less human. And that really struck, you know, that got to me personally, but it also it really focused my work. I had worked at, as you'll note in my written evidence, that at Mana magazine, and I had a short-term contract at Radio New Zealand. I'd previously done work around the high number of Māori in prisons. I had heard about welfare homes, but I had no real concept of the scale of it. And it wasn't until I got a copy of Lizzie Stanley's book, and at first I was like, yeah, okay. I mean, a lot of the stuff was very similar to St. Stephen's in many respects, but it was the scale of it. The scale of the abuse, especially the sexual abuse, that really kind of got to me, I suppose. And I started to, and it was obvious that most of those victims were Māori. And I started to ask, well, what does that do if you say, take that ballpark number of 100,000 and say 70 to 80,000 of that group are Māori, and then not only have they been damaged, but then you start to escalate that and multiply it by their children and their grandchildren, and you've got a problem, to say the least. And so I was struggling to find my place a little bit within Radio New Zealand. I'd come from a long-form writing background, investigative background. Radio New Zealand's very daily news focused. And I was trying to do a multimedia sort of story around this. But I started initially talking to, I guess you could call them experts. Judge Henwood was one. Lizzie herself was another. Sonia Cooper. Ros Noonan, who had previously been at the Human Rights Commission. And I got some really strong background material, and that laid a foundation. And I guess to summarise that, what they were saying consistently between them was that there's been this abuse, but the Crown's response to that abuse has been it's been about, to put it colloquially, covering the government's arse. It's been about minimising the state's liability, both legally and financially. And there's a number of incidents and examples there, which is in my written brief, that, in my view, showed quite a consistent pattern of the state denying the allegations. And not only that, also, if you want to bring it back to an individual, if you have an individual perpetrator, particularly when we're talking about sexual crimes, there's a tendency for that perpetrator to silence the victim in various ways, threats, manipulation. And if you scale that up to the state was doing, I believe, the same thing.
Aaron, just remember the speed.
Sorry. So that was, I guess, the general gist of, and I tracked that happened over a long period of time, and I tracked that aspects of that journey, if you like. But I knew that a story like this is pretty technical, and it doesn't really capture an audience unless you, I guess, humanise it, for want of a better term. And I knew that, to really make the story fly, so to speak, I needed to find somebody who had been through that experience. Through a couple of contacts I had in the mongrel mob, I ended up being put in touch with Jimmy McLaughlin, and I'll always, this sounds a bit silly, but I'll always be grateful to Jimmy, because his quiet telling of his experience was extremely moving, and I had many colleagues who felt the same when they read that story. And he had been picked up for wagging school, and I believe his parents weren't home when the police took him home. And as you've heard from Sir Kim, the next step was the welfare homes. And like many people, he spent several years in those homes. There was a reference this morning to Owairaka, and I think Oliver put up that it was for 14 to 17-year-olds. I was sitting beside Jimmy, and I sort of turned to him and said, "How old were you?" Because I was pretty sure he wasn't 14 and he was 10. And so yeah, it's like I say, and I just wanted to really give a shout out to Jimmy. He came down to the protest on this issue, and he was there, and I said to him, and I meant it, and I still do, that, it's like, bro, he started this. And he was a bit embarrassed, but yeah, so that was a long form, it was 6,500 words. I had already interviewed Judge Henwood, but at that stage when I first interviewed her, the government hadn't responded to the class report, and it was kind of snuck out quietly, if you like. That's just my interpretation, of course.
Are you talking about the written response from the government?
Yes. And when I stumbled on it quite by accident, there was no press release, and when I read it, I knew immediately that Judge Henwood would be furious. And then I tried to get hold of her, and she was overseas, and by the time I got through to her, she gave me sort of 20 minutes. She was in transit, and she kind of unloaded big time. And I walked out of that recording booth and I thought to myself, is she allowed to do that? Because a judge taking a crack at the government was, I sort of thought that's not kind of how things work or something. And what that did is I had this big contextual feature, if you like, and then I had a very sharp news angle of Judge Henwood really socking it to the government. And I had a very good producer who briefed. We had the, quite by chance, Kim Hill was on filling in on Morning Report. And as many people will be aware, Kim's got a ferocious, well-earned reputation as being a pretty brutal interviewer. And Tolly had been avoiding giving me an interview, and it was like, okay, you don't want to talk to me? Talk to Kim Hill. And Tolly rang up, I think, a couple of minutes before the 7:30 news, I think possibly hoping to be saved by the bell. The producer saw that Kim was on a roll and just pushed the news off the cliff and let her go. And that was, I knew I'd done that, the story had sort of blown up. It really, yeah. I came into the newsroom and I was on the train and I couldn't hear it live, but the whole newsroom was fizzing. Not only that, it wasn't just some journalistic thing, there was a number of survivors were ringing in and walking in to newsrooms, like there was one walked into Christchurch newsroom. And yeah, it's, I guess, as a combination of things, I think we had these people who knew what they were talking about, and you had Jimmy and his experience, and you had this dismissive response from the Crown, and you know, the strength of and courage of Judge Henwood just going, no, that's not good enough. And yeah, it kind of just, I never say I broke the story, but I did give it a good kick. Yeah.
One of the things that came out of that story that you mentioned in your brief is the human rights report. Do you want to fill in some detail around that? Where did that report come to you from?
Like all good journalists, I cannot reveal my sources. No, I got it. Somebody had got it through an OIA request and passed it on to me. Yeah, and it didn't really matter where it came from. It just, you could see the correspondence backwards and forwards between the Attorney General, Chris Finlayson. He wouldn't give me an interview either, and Ros Noonan. And I got in touch with Ros and asked her about the background to that, and she was, her take on it was that they had tried to engage with Crown law right through that process. Sorry, the report was focused on, you know, the state abuse and the Crown's response to it. The report was in draft and it went backwards and forwards. And according to Ros, and I take her word for it, they went to great lengths to involve Crown law in discussing what they thought of the report. It was, you know, well, she thought, well researched. And she said that the Crown didn't engage at all until the last minute, and then just sort of threw the spanner in the works to try and, in her view, sort of disrupt it. And Chris Finlayson, the correspondence from him was by that stage with David Rutherford, who had taken over from Ros. And it was quite, the tone was quite, in my reading anyway, quite arrogant. And again, it reinforced this idea that the Crown was just not going to listen, did not want to hear anything that contradicted its position. And so that, and the other thing that Ros kind of mentioned to me that has stuck with me and continues to be a line of investigation, I'm not sure if he's still here, Mike Wesley-Smith, I've done quite a bit of work with Mike, and one of the major focuses that we've worked on, and I believe Mike's got a series coming out, just to promo out there. But Ros said something about, I was very concerned about the original scope of this, about the 99 cut-off date. And the reason I was concerned was because, for me, the Helen Clark government was the one that really was at the centre of developing the legal response and the legal strategy. And that, I'll come back to this and I'll just touch on it here, but that started really in earnest with Lake Alice. There's probably earlier things that happened, but that's for me quite a major turning point. But Ros said something that has always irritated me, or has been a kind of a motivation to find out why. And she said that there were officials from Crown Law were pressuring the Attorney General at the time, Margaret Wilson, to, quote, shut it down. And that to me just says that raised some red flags. You've got these major allegations, proven allegations, I believe, of some horrific abuse. And, you know, I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand Crown Law's kind of, you know, internal operations and deliberations, but, you know, I would have thought there was a responsibility for Crown Law to investigate criminal allegations. And yet here the Crown was shutting it down, apparently. And to me, there seemed to be a real internal contradiction, conflict of interest, I guess is the term that comes to mind for me. So yeah, that report never initially saw the light of day until, yeah, I got hold of it, and then here you go, here it is. And it's pretty much said what Judge Henwood said, to be honest. It said the same thing, that we need to understand what went wrong here. There needs to be an independent inquiry. And for the Attorney General to try and say, no, we don't, yeah, it just seemed a bit strange.
So you've described, Aaron, that was the first story, justice delayed, justice denied, and you've added in some colour there about the public response. Your brief further goes on to the follow-up of that story, and that's where you touch on more the element of gang membership coming out of the welfare homes. Do you want to speak about that specifically?
I'd heard from a number of sources, so Lizzie's book refers to it, conversations I've had with people from corrections, gang members themselves. I'd sort of got this very strong impression that, there was a direct line between not only the welfare homes in prison, but welfare homes in gangs. And I was very aware that, you know, when I looked and did a bit of a Google trawl before I did the first story, I was aware that there are a number of journalists who had covered this story before. There'd been a front page headline, and then nothing had happened. And I didn't want to join that club. I wanted to shift it and make something happen. And so I thought, you know, I wanted to do a strong follow-up, and I had the great pleasure of interviewing Kim Workman around this topic, and he probably knows as much as anybody. And by that stage I had some reasonable, you know, good relationships with a couple of guys in the mongrel mob, including Harry Tam. And he invited me to a gang hui in Featherston that he'd arranged. He was aware of my work. And there was, I later found out that there was, there'd been some gang shooting. There was a bit of tension there, because I noticed there weren't any women or children, so I think there was a few things in the background that I wasn't aware of, fortunately. But there was mongrel mob there was black power there predominantly, there was, I think, a couple of nomads, there's probably about 50 guys. And I had a drive from Levin round to sort of Featherston to think about, how am I going to sell this one? And I talked about my previous work and mentioned Francis and Jimmy and Edge, Te Whaiti. But I said to them, look, you know, the way I put it was, I talked about whakapapa, and I said, you know, the audience that I have is this white middle class Pākehā, and they look at you and they see a brown face and a patch, and I said, you know, I don't need to explain to you the conclusions they draw from that. But I said, what I'm interested in is like this porphyry process of, where are you from? What's your whakapapa? And I said, if you have come through these welfare homes, the state is your parent. And there was this very, there was silence. And I wasn't quite sure how it was going down, because there were some pretty stony faces in front of me. And anyway, we sort of wrapped up, and I greeted them all. And shortly after that, there was two conversations that I'll refer to. I'll refer to Albie Ipiri first. But I sat around the lunch table with a few of them, and all of them pretty much had been through those places. Apuni, Kohitere, you know, or Wairākei. And it pretty much confirmed my hunch that there's something going on here. And so I managed to convince Albie to go on the record with that. I'll just come back, just step back for a moment. One of the other things that was going on at that time was Stuart Nash was in, you know, Labour Party and was in opposition, and he was kicking up and making a song and dance about smashing the gangs. You know, he was the spokesperson for police, and it annoyed me. And I didn't mention him by name, but I was essentially countering the kind of argument that he was making. And I sort of angled the interview with Albie around this whole question of the government being responsible for this stuff. And Albie kind of rose to the challenge of that question and really put it back on the government and the state. And it was a very, very strong interview, largely because of Albie's kind of, you know, ability to articulate his experience. And I'd just like to segue here a little bit, because now we've got an opposition that's the National Party, and we've got the leader of the opposition, Simon Bridges, saying pretty much exactly the same thing that Stuart Nash was saying 3 years ago. In fact, as Kim Workman pointed out, it just goes in this constant loop. And permission to be frank here, Mr. Chair. I'm sick and tired of it, listening to these politicians, and it seems to me that the politicians that most like to dump on Māori are Māori. Now, Winston Peters is going to hate this, but Simon Bridges has learnt that he's learnt it from Winston. Paula Bennett, so Shane Jones, they've all learnt this little trick from Winston. They're coming back to this public conversation that I mentioned, and getting the votes and getting the clicks and selling the papers. They've learnt that the best way to get that white middle class vote is to shit on their own people. Now, Simon Bridges has got no idea what some of these individuals have been through. And it infuriates me. He wants to talk about, and not just him, he's part of a whole pattern, about being tough on crime. The only problem with that is that he's very selective about the criminals. He's very selective about the crimes. You know, I've sat and listened to individuals, including gang members, who, you know, have been raped multiple times. Simon Bridges was in government for 9 years. When did he ever talk about those crimes? When did he ever talk about getting tough on those criminals? And let's go to Winston Peters. We've heard from Oliver Sutherland. You know, this stuff has been hiding in plain sight for decades. Why has Winston Peters not kicked up about that? It infuriates me. They use people who have already been abused to further their political careers. Shane Jones, he made a statement he wanted to nuke gang members. Wipe them off the face of the earth. He wants to portray himself as this, Māori boy from the north. What about all those other Māori boys from the north that ended up in those places? What about them? I am sick of it. I'm sick of listening to it. The crimes that have been committed against these individuals, men and women, are horrific. I don't know if anyone noticed during Oliver's testimony, there were 2 women who had to bolt out of this room when he was describing the stuff that went on at those girls' homes. I know one of them, another one I introduced myself to. They had to get out of here because it was too traumatic for them. Now, why haven't these politicians like Simon Bridges spoken up and stood up for that, you know, being hard on that crime? I'm sorry, I've had enough of listening to this message, and the media has got a responsibility to knock that over. They don't, because the victims are the gang members. Duncan Garner, he made a public statement that gang members don't have any human rights. Before they were a gang member, before they had their patch on, before they masked up with the tattoos, they were little boys. They had their human rights stripped when they were kids and violated then. What about that, Mr. Garner? I'm sick of these political figures, these media figures who want to shit on these people and they've never met them, never taken an interest.
Aaron, if we probably might just take a break there or catch our breath a little.
Sorry. Moving right along.
I don't want to curtail your evidence on that point.
I'm done.
It was always going to be an impassioned point. So I do thank you for your points there. We probably don't need to rehash the actual journalistic article that you put forward because it was essentially that argument.
Yeah.
Are you fine to continue?
Yes, I'm fine.
Yesterday we heard some significant evidence from Moana Jackson about the parallels with Indigenous experience in other colonised countries. You also wrote an article about that centred on a survivor story.
Sure.
Do you want to briefly cover that as well?
Yeah. I'm honoured that Tyrone Marks is here today. I've got to know Tyrone and, I'm honoured to call him a friend. His story is one of the worst I've heard, and yet he's this remarkable individual who's just, I'm astonished at times how he survived what he has. I had always thought that there was a parallel with the Stolen Generations, and that originally was based on my experience of adoption. But yeah, certainly when I looked into this issue, it's there's just such strong parallels. One example of that is if you take the Canadian report and which I've referred to, and Lizzie's book, and you put them side by side, and it's, you know, it's like reading the same kind of document in places. I think there's some differences in terminology and methods, if you like, but the pattern's the same. You know, you take the land, you sort of take the culture, and then, oh, you guys are still here. Okay, well, we'll take your kids and sort of knock them into shape. I think in New Zealand, if you look at Canada, the residential schools were residential boarding schools for over 100 years. I think in New Zealand it was kind of, it played out differently. You had the native schools, which weren't boarding schools, but they stripped the language. And then as those native schools were winding down, the welfare homes were winding up, and as the urbanisation, you know, and that shift happened. So one question that I raised with some of the people I talked to, Wilton Littlechild, who's Native American, Canadian, has played huge roles in the UN, etc., and was a residential school survivor.
Was he also a commissioner? He's
also a commissioner. He was fantastic to talk to, and he articulated, he wasn't really familiar with New Zealand's situation, but what he described in both his own experience and in the bigger picture was very similar. I also talked to Peter Reid from Australia, who coined the term stolen generations. I could talk at length about those guys because they were fantastic. One thing that struck me was they talked about how it took a long time for what you might want to call the narrative to kind of sink in with not only the general public, the white public, but even survivors themselves. And Peter Reid talked very clearly about this. Many just did not understand the bigger context of what had happened to them, and likewise in Canada. And when they were telling me this, I was actually, it kind of scared me a bit, because it's like, well, we're about 20 years behind that. And we're not even at square one. I mean, you know your shithouse when you're lagging behind Australia. So that, you know, and I felt then a responsibility to, okay, put that narrative in place. And like, you know, I'm not going to do it on my own, but I'm certainly going to try and contribute to it. So yeah, for me, and then I guess, if you look at, say, for example, the Māori language claim, there's a kind of a famous moment where, I don't know who it was, but asked Sir James Henare that, hey, there's no actual specific legislation here that says the Māori language shall be abolished. And Sir James Henare says, yes, well, there might not be any legislation, but there's certainly a gentleman's agreement. And I put that whole question about the specific legislation to Vicky Tauli Corpus, I think her name is, UN Indigenous Rapporteur. And she said, no, it doesn't matter. If you've got the same methods happening, you've got the same outcomes, it's the same thing. You don't need the legislation. Because if you look at Australia and Canada, there is specific legislation. And I think that needs to be kept in mind, that although we didn't have this specific edict to take Māori children, all these other policies that were going on added up to the same result. I'd also like to just make, if I can, a distinction between legislation and policy/practice. I know you're all very learned judges and lawyers, but for example, with adoption, that legislation has been in place for, over 60 years now. It hasn't changed significantly, but the policy has swung all over the place. And from when I was adopted, and even earlier, things were quite different. Whereas now, I mean, I've got two nieces that have been adopted from the Philippines. My birth father has adopted two girls, and that was open. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, you can have the legislation, but there's all these unelected sort of bureaucrats and officials and practitioners who can kind of make it up as they go along in some cases. And it can be, I don't know, just, you know, the latest fashion. And somebody gets an idea in their head, or it's the public pressure, or the public, you know, the social environment. I mean, it was a shameful thing for a girl to get pregnant when she was a teenager back in the 1960s. It's not, that social attitude's not there now. So I guess I'm just trying to highlight that there's can be quite the legislation's not going to tell you a whole lot sometimes. It's actually at that other level that things operate. You probably know that, but anyway.
So we've covered your investigative work and some of your arguments around this issue. If we can move now to, if we can frame it around your article, you've referenced it on page 14, paragraph 61, if you want to catch back up to where we are in the brief.
Sorry, 14.
Yeah, on top of page 14. So this section of your brief covers another argument that you made in an article about the behaviour of the state, which again you can take the briefs as read and the article as read. But are there some key aspects of the brief that you'd just like to highlight for the record today?
Yeah, I guess journalism's often about explaining quite complex things in a way that the average intelligent layperson can understand. And, you know, a lot of this information, and you're going to hear more of it than I am, is quite complex. And I guess when I looked at the state's behaviour over a long period of time, you know, it's a bit of a struggle to sort of explain it in a way that's succinct. And but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, the state is a legal person, and what if I was to try and describe that person? How would I do that? And this person's been accused of committing some horrendous crimes. What's been their response? And when I broke it down like that, the analogy, and it is an analogy that I came up with, is that, well, actually the state's behaving like a psychopath. And you go through the list of us, what, you know, tick all the boxes of a psychopath, you know, no remorse, no insight into their offending, manipulative, lying, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, people who work at Crown Law or psychopaths individually. I mean, I've met a couple that are quite pleasant people. But the behaviour of the Crown overall, you add it up, it's about looking after itself. I think you've heard the evidence from, you know, many people and the causes of some of that original abuse. And you could say, is it negligence? You could, you know, you could not explain it away, but you can explain it. But that's one thing. I think the Crown's response to that, it hasn't been some kind of oversight or negligence. It's been very sophisticated, and it's been very deliberate. Just as an aside, I mean, I get all sorts of tidbits and information, and, you know, sometimes I can verify them, sometimes I can't. But, you know, I've heard now, recently, that Crown Law has got more funding to respond to this Royal Commission than the Royal Commission's got itself. And I'm not, like I say, I don't know if that's correct, and I'm just raising it because I'd be interested to know. I'm getting the impression from the demeanour of one commissioner, at least, that that's not they're not aware of that. Now, for me, it's about, if I was to, for example, I've made a lot of official information requests, and often it's not MSD that you're dealing with. Sitting in behind MSD is Crown Law, whenever you're talking about this issue in particular. And for me, it's been Crown Law all the way through that has, I referred earlier to Roz saying Crown Law is trying to shut it down. And, you know, there's a whole lot of events that are in my statement. I don't need to cover it here exactly, but you can see this arc of the Crown's behaviour over a long period of time. I haven't got all the evidence. I've got bits and pieces, but I've got enough to build an impression that the state has always been about acting in its own interests.
So that's,
yeah.
So that's your characterisation. You put it forward in that article, and you have some examples in your brief about that. I just thought I might inquire with Mr. Chair, if we're not going to go through the examples word for word, if that's not necessary, would you like to take a short break or just continue with this witness, because we'd be close to wrapping up? Just continue. Thank you. If that's okay with you, Mr. Smale.
It's fine. Yeah.
Because I am conscious of the time. So the two examples that you used being Lake Alice and the White trial.
Yep.
If I can just direct maybe any lagging questions that you have that you might challenge this commission with in relation to where your investigation ended and what you think could be learned from what was available to you and how far you could take it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've already sort of touched on it in a couple of ways. Again, I mean, my first story and my current work actually is all, has been very focused on the Crown's response. And when I say Crown, it's predominantly Crown Law, which spans a number of governments. That has advised several governments now on its response, and I've always found that response extremely problematic. I mean, I'll just give a little illustration. I mean, I'll touch on Lake Alice a little bit again, and then I'll just give another random example of which I've got a multitude. There's some serious questions around Lake Alice in terms of, I'll start with Justice Gallen's report. Now, as you will know from reading the evidence, and you would have already probably done some research yourself, there was a civil claim in the late 90s, and that was eventually settled by the Helen Clark government, and a sum was paid. Part of that process was Justice Gallen was asked to divvy out that amount. I think Oliver may have referred to that. And that report, Justice Gallen, and that's all he was asked to do, was to figure out who should get what. But he went through and thoroughly investigated, Oliver's mentioned it. Now that report was damning. And there was a couple of things. One, that report was leaked, and the media got hold of it. I believe it was the Evening Post, and were about to publish a story, and there was an injunction put on them. And
by who?
Crown, so that it wouldn't be made public. And that went to court. I believe it was Justice Ron Young, I believe, said no, it can be released. And it was, and I've got the copy, and I'm sure the Commission's got a copy. And what's curious about that is all Justice Gallen does is lay out the facts as he saw them. So what's the problem? Why go to that length? And who was involved in that decision-making process about trying? Now, that's just one little aspect of this case, one small aspect. There were some of those claimants, then their allegations were then forwarded to the police. And this is where it gets really, really weird and murky. And I guess I have to be careful I don't speculate, but forgive me if I venture there. But there's just this really strange process over a good decade almost, where those allegations were never, in my view, and in the view of a number of people, never properly investigated. And then the police came out, I think it was in 2008-9, and made a statement that there was not enough evidence to prosecute, which is really weird when you put that statement alongside Justice Gallen's report. You just put those two side by side, and not only that, Mike and I have been digging around, and Mike's going to be launching the big boat very shortly, but there was never really a police investigation anyway. As far as we can tell, the evidence points to, I think there was one person was spoken to, it might have even been Hake Halo, and that was taken as representative. It wasn't. There were a number of other cases that would have been, were quite different, I think. There was also, I'm sort of losing my track here. Oh, sorry, there was, again, Crown Law's positions is really, there's this conflict of interest because they took statements from a number of staff. Now, they took those statements not to investigate them for any criminal activity. They took them to, they were acting like their defence lawyers, effectively. Because they were working for the state, they were going to defend them. And I guess this is where I start to speculate, because it's, my understanding is that if anybody who's a state employee is convicted of serious crimes, then the Crown's liability, the Crown is liable. And that conviction in a criminal court is rock solid evidence. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just kind of layman's understanding here, so please forgive me if I'm kind of venturing into areas I am not qualified to. But again, there were, when the national government came in, just before the police released their report, Chris Finlayson, I believe, waived privilege on 6 of those staff statements. Mike and I found out recently that there's actually a substantial number that they haven't waived privilege on. And I guess, again, speculating, the 6 that were released were probably of no real risk, if you like, in terms of improper behaviour.
Those would be just some of the questions that you...
Those are just some of the questions I'd like to put out there. What is those other statements that were taken by the Crown from staff at Lake Ellis, what's in them? Is it incriminating? And if it is incriminating, it incriminates state employees. And for the state, that's a big problem. Because if those allegations are proven, then, the Crown's on the hook for more than it paid out. That's, that's an opinion, but that's what it looks like to me. And it looks like that to a couple of other people we've spoken to.
And you have some questions about the white litigation strategy as well.
My brief of evidence, it was hard to sort of figure out how to narrow it all down. I think there's a very direct link between The legal strategy that was developed, I haven't seen it. I've tried to get a copy of it, and of course legal privilege has kind of scuppered that attempt. But I did get some documents in my OIA request, and there's a report to Wyatt Creech, and a lot of it's redacted out, and it's about the Lake Ellis situation. And there's a couple of things in there that are notable. One of them is that they lay out some options. That's, you know, that's standard and that's something to be expected. But one of the options that they lay out in terms of the Crown's response is, I mean, one of them is let it go to court, let the courts test it. Yeah, there's several options. One of the options that they canvass, but you can't see the detail, is use all technical defences. The other thing that's notable is that you've got these, in one paragraph, it makes note and flags that most of the kids that were in Lake Ellis had come from other institutions. And so there's this very real kind of, that they mention that they also make allegations about those places. And so I think it's being flagged that it's not, we don't just have to worry about Lake Ellis. We've got a great big kind of elephant galloping down the road at us, and we need to figure out what to do. And now that was in, when was it, late 90s. Now if you fast forward to 2007 on the White trial, you could see that there's this very, I mean, I've read the transcript, I mean, I've talked to Sonia Cooper, I've read the decision, some of the transcript, had conversations with Sonia, and I think Sonia has basically been, for the entire time she's been working in this area, fighting that strategy of using all technical defences. And not only has she been fighting it, survivors have been fighting it. And that, again, I'm piecing together little fragments, and I can't see the whole picture. I would love for the Royal Commission to kind of fill in those gaps, because I think it, again, will show the state's response and, you know, was that the adequacy or otherwise of that response.
So that would wrap up the characterisation of the state's behaviour. And you had some closing comments around the treatment of Māori, particularly Māori men, in relation to abuse and care. Yeah. I think in some respects it's kind of... sorry, in reference to the brief for the commissioners, from page 21 onwards. Just check myself. It's, I mean, already been fairly well canvassed that, you know, Māori men are the biggest cohort here, and I want to emphasise that my focus has been on Māori men for the reasons I've already outlined. I don't in any way want to exclude or diminish the suffering of non-Māori or women at all. And in fact, for many Pākehā, they were actually got harder treatment because they were in the minority and they were smaller. So, but I guess standing back from individual stories, if you look at the big picture, it's very clear who the biggest group are, and they're Māori men. I'm sort of reluctant to, you know, as a journalist, I like to put other people up on the platform, and it's kind of a little bit embarrassing to try and, I don't want to claim ever to speak on behalf of survivors. I don't. I just give them the platform. One of my jobs has always been to convince people that, you know,
that are very downtrodden and have suffered immense abuse, that, you know, they are worthy to be heard. And, you know, I hope the Commission takes, you know, that approach. I mean, I could give you multiple examples. I don't want to speak on behalf of survivors. They can speak for themselves, and I hope they do. I guess one example for to try and illustrate some of the stories I've heard. Some of the other witnesses talk about what's been going on in the welfare homes. There's one individual I've got to know who was in, for good reason, but had been removed from a particular situation at the age of 6, probably earlier. Went through welfare homes. You can see through his file there's this constant pattern: abscond, 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 running away. And there's quite a negative slant put on that by the welfare staff in his file. You talk to the individual, and the reason he was absconding and running away was because he was being sexually abused in particular in those places. And there's just this massive pattern going on, and there's an escalation. These kids, they had very limited choices, but when they did, they took them, whether it was fighting back or running away. And so, but there's this escalation that happens. It's like snakes and ladders without the ladders. And then this escalates, and he goes into the welfare homes, and he runs away from there. Then there's the secure, the you know, solitary confinement, and on it goes. And in each of those welfare homes, I mean, I've actually built up this spreadsheet of perpetrators in these different places, and you kind of overlay that onto his time through there, and look at his actual statement of claim, and there's these perpetrators that he's encountering all the way through. And then he ends up, the escalation continues, and he ends up at Lake Alice by the time he's 12, 13. And that's just another house of horrors that's on another level all again. And the ECT, etc. And the sexual abuse, actually, and the ECT gets a big play when we're talking about Lake Alice, but the sexual abuse was rife as well. And you remember, you got criminally insane adults that kids are being chucked in with. So it doesn't take much imagination to figure out some of the stuff that was going on there. And this individual has got what I would call a very robust sense of humour. And please forgive the language here.
Just before you tell the story, for the purpose of the record, do you have the consent of the survivor?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
He's supporting you telling this story here.
Yeah, I checked with him. And he once said to me, he's got this rather brutal sense of humour that is, I guess, his way of coping or trying to cope. The trauma's still there. It's a coping mechanism, if you like. And he once said to me that he had, quote, been fucked up the arse so many times, you could park a truck up there and turn it around, unquote. And then he kind of laughs about it. And, you know, I don't mean to be offensive or to, you know, I suppose, you know, for many survivors that would not be the way they talk about it. That's the way he talks about it. And when you hear the scale of the abuse he's been through, I think that's probably a fairly accurate summary. And just, you know, listening to Oliver Sutherland's just stunning evidence this morning in the incarceration of kids. That individual was in, I think it was Mount Eden, by the time he was 14, 15. And he was in one of those solitary confinement cells that Oliver talked to. And I believe Oliver, I'm pretty sure Oliver encountered him in his work. And he was in D Block by the time he was 16. And since then, he's spent 35 years in and out of jail. And this is the scale of what we're talking about here. And he describes, the suicides in D Block and reels off the names. And, I guess people end up in D Block for all sorts of reasons, but I was always curious, well, did they go on the same journey as you? Yeah, and he can tell you where he knew them as a child and which home they went through. And even in some cases, there was individuals where, in one case, he was raped by the same individual at virtually the same time. And it's, I've spent hours with this guy just talking, and he will tell you story after story. And I've spent probably, I don't know, weeks, maybe months, just chatting. And I think that what he's told me is only still a small percentage of what he's been through. And the first time I met him, after about a 3-hour conversation, I drove from his place down to the petrol station, and I can remember very distinctly just being in this fog of just shaking my head and thinking, how the hell does any human being go through that much trauma and still kind of standing? I mean, he's got his challenges, don't worry about that, but it's just the fact he's still alive. And when you say survivor, people trot that word out kind of a bit glibly sometimes. Surviving what? Well, you listen to this guy's story and it's just astonishing. And he's not the only one. And there's a lot of, this individual's got, I think, a very healthy attitude in many respects, in his ability to talk about it. What concerns me, though, is that there's a whole lot of individuals out there, and they're predominantly Māori men, who have just closed up and don't talk about it. As an aside, I'm working on a number of things. I've got a PhD I've started into this very subject in a documentary, but I'm working on, and have been working on for some time, a story about, well, it's not a story yet, it's a conversation, regarding some serious allegations of sexual abuse, allegations against some very prominent New Zealanders. And I won't say any more than that, because I've got a lot of due diligence to do to get that story to a point where it will get published, and it may never get published, I don't know, I hope it does. But I find those allegations credible. One of the very, very sad things about it is that one of those individuals recently took his life. And that's, I guess, the ultimate silencing. There's people that won't make it here. And the time that I've been working on this, there's probably half a dozen people I know who, well, some of them I don't know, I've heard of, people I've spoken to and know them, and have passed away in what I would call premature deaths. That one's one of them. Suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, P. I think there's a lot of people will talk about gang members on P. Yeah, well, maybe a lot of them are just sort of self-medicating. There's several individuals I've heard only a couple of weeks ago. There's a guy I know, one of the founding members of the Nomads, and there's a guy that he was close to, who was, a feared individual in his day, but was reduced to a physical wreck from P use, and he went through that same journey. And yeah, people want to talk about P and gangs. Well, maybe that's just their way of coping with some pretty ugly stuff.
We're probably drawing to a close of the total evidence briefed here. Aaron, do you want to close with your final paragraphs on page 26? Again, if you can confirm that you've got the support of the survivor there mentioned to use his words. Again,
coming back to Tyrone, who this is Tyron and I have had a lot of conversations, and he's got a very, he's been through them all, and including Lake Ellis, and as I say, just a remarkable individual. And this is part of the story I did for Al Jazeera on stolen generations, and I concluded with this quote because I think it's, yes, he's got a powerful story to tell, and you know, I hope one day you get to hear it. It's up to him, obviously, but he gave me permission to well, I've used it in the story, but he has verified that he's happy for me to read it out here, and he puts it back on. It's not about, you know, he knows what his story is, and it's again this point I make about the behaviour of the state. And he's been fighting, well, the Lake Ellis settlement. He's fought through that. He's currently, you know, on Sonia Cooper's books, and that's been, I think he's been there for about 12 years on her books. And his remark was, I think, summed it up for me. And I'll read it out. Speaking about the state, he said, "They just breach every principle, ethically, morally, and they don't take responsibility. We've had to take responsibility for everything we do in life, but they don't. They haven't. I know my story, but I want to hear the state tell its story. I want to hear them give their explanation for what they did to us." And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Aaron. If I just check with Mr. Mill. Thank you, Mr. Smale. I'll hand back to Mr. Chair. There's no further from
Thank you, Ms.
Councillor
Haronga. May I ask, first of all, if any council wish to cross-examine Mr. Smale? Thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, are there any questions that, in your view, have? Dr. Erueti.
Tēnā koe, Chair. Tēnā koe, Mr. Smale. I have a few questions about, the first question is about the work on, your work on the residences. And it's curious to me that there's a lot of academic, journalistic focus on the residences like Kohitere and Hokio and others, but less attention it seems on foster care. Although you've got survivors who are moving in and out of institutions into foster care. So I think it's a concern for me that we know less about the family homes and the other larger homes, like Tower Hill, for example. Even though, as we heard from Keith Whiffen the other day, that the experience that he had there reminded him, well, the experience that he had in the family home reminded him of the experience that he had at Apuni.
Right.
And I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, about this gap, if you like, blind spot.
Yeah. I mean, I actually revisited that question a short while ago, looking at, I had another look at Lizzie Stanley's book, and she gives a bit of a breakdown on the sort of, the percentages, if you like. Yeah, stats is not my strong point, unfortunately, but it was quite noticeable that, for example, and I think this probably needs to be kind of highlighted a little bit in the public conversation that I mentioned, where, for example, the church homes accounted for in the figures, it was a survey, I think, that Lizzie was referring to, I haven't got the figures at hand, sorry, but it was quite noticeable to me that the actual church-run homes, and I don't know the definition on that, but it was 4%. And then I think it was, I stand to be corrected, but I think the state-run homes were something like 12 to 15% or something. And then I can't remember what the family homes were. It wasn't as big, but yeah, the biggest group was actually foster homes. And yeah, I mean, sometimes you read something and you miss it the first time round, and I'm going through this at the moment with my research where I'm revisiting a lot of this stuff, and it's, okay, yeah, the foster homes. And I guess, yeah, I mean, a lot of the emphasis has been on these tangible bricks and mortar institutions, because there they are. I mean, I live in Levin. You know, some of those old buildings are still standing. I've been down there a few times, and it's quite eerie to see a physical place. But there's a couple of survivors I've spoken to, and those foster homes, I think, were very much, my impression is that it was a lot of the kids going into the foster homes were young. You know, you're talking kind of 5 or 6 up, and I think when a couple of the examples of individuals I know, there gets a point where if there's, I suppose if you think about it, I mean, the abuse that I've heard described to me in foster homes, you know, I don't. It's always a little. I always get a little uncomfortable ranking kind of certain crimes, but yeah, some of the worst stuff I've heard has been in foster homes. And when you think about it, there's just no control. I mean, those foster parents had utter, total control over those children. There was no other staff who could have mitigated or modified some of the worst behaviour by other staff members. If those foster parents were bad, they were bad. That was it. And so, yeah, I take your point. I mean, there is I think, a need to. And again, the children are at an age where they are extremely vulnerable. And then there's, as I said, there's this pattern you can see with some individuals where they bolt and run. And I would suggest, if you are looking at files like that, that you kind of read them against the grain and take that as a possible, might be other reasons, but a possible potential flag as to there's something wrong there, there's something going on. If a kid feels safe, but there's a little bit of a balancing act there, because sometimes a kid has gone through a whole series of foster homes where they have been abused, and then they get to a good one, and they just have been so damaged and have lost so much trust that they can't actually settle. And, you know, I've had conversations with individuals who, you know, they will say, they can remember, yeah, that one wasn't bad, you know, that person was all right, they beat me up, but, you know, they weren't raping me. But, yeah, I think there is, you're right, there is a huge, it's almost overlooked, I think. I'd have to go back and check the survey that Liz is referring to, but it's, you know, it's probably a snapshot that is indicative, but it's certainly worth, I think, considering. And then, as I mentioned, there's, from the foster homes, there's this escalation. I don't know what the controls or the accountability structures or the vetting or the screening, if you like, of those foster homes. I don't know what they were like. I mean, there was one example I can think of where they were struggling to place a particular child, and then up pops this individual who they were desperate to find somewhere to put him, and they put him in that particular foster home, and he was passed around what I would just almost consider a paedophile ring. That the individual, at least a couple of those foster parents knew each other, and there was abuse there's allegations of abuse going on at both of them. And that, that kind of, there's a lot to dig into there and try and understand. But sorry, and it's a feeder, I think, because once those kids start exhibiting that kind of behaviour, that they're running away and they're exhibiting behaviour that's the welfare officers criticise, then that's it, bang, you're off to Owaraka. And that's the next step up.
It's something that definitely requires the inquiry's attention. The other point I have is that I take your point and acknowledge it on the role of Māori boys and the impact that it's had on them. I do think, again, perhaps it's with foster care as well, that there's another untold story that hasn't been, that requires more recognition and space of the impact on Māori women. And we saw Oliver earlier today talk about the significant numbers of young Māori women who were escalated up to Borstal in the 70s. So I suspect too that I take your point and acknowledge it about the impact on young Māori boys too, but there's more work that we need to be doing to explore about the impact that apprehension by police and child welfare officers have had on young Māori women. Fareham House and the other Māori girls' schools.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should mention Fareham House. I was, in my research, I'm kind of looking at specifically at what's happened to Māori, and I was kind of astonished because that's one of the few homes that was specifically set up for Māori. And the rationale, it was set up, I think, in about the 1940s. And of course, you had the war on, and so you had a lot of sort of soldiers in camps like Palmerston North, etc. And the rationale for it was that that these Māori girls were kind of promiscuous, and therefore we had to contain them in a separate kind of institution in case they corrupted these, pure little Pākehā girls. And that's, it's kind of a, I won't say an anomaly, but it's a kind of a curious example of the fact that, at least in that period, that Māori behaviour, if you like, or attitudes towards Māori, whether it was Māori girls, and their adolescent girls, or whether it was Māori whānau, and this is slightly off topic, but it's not. For example, one of the things that I'm trying to look at in my research is what were all these factors? We've heard many of them, but take for example, the urbanisation, and you had places like Freeman's Bay. You couldn't get any change out of a couple of million there now, but it was a slum in the 50s and earlier. And I can't remember the State Services Corporation or something. There was a government department that was responsible for housing. And now Freeman's Bay, there was all this slum housing there, and of course, you had Māori coming in from, the urban migration was kicking off big time. And the council decided, right, we're going to clear these slums out, just bulk a lot, and there was these developments that are going on in that area. And it's this whole thing, you see these references in this language around Māori, the Māori problem, or Māori social adjustment, or integration. There's all sorts of euphemisms used. And Māori Affairs were trying to get resources to house people. And not only that, the State Services Corporation, I think that's the name of it, said, well, no, you guys are responsible for not only Māori, but all those Pacific Island people and Indians. And Māori Affairs pushed back and says, well, it's not that we have anything against Polynesians or Indian people, but this is our responsibility here. And so from there you get these Māori then, and many of them, other ethnicities in that community ended up getting sort of dumped out in Otara. And people often think of state housing as being for poor brown people. Originally it wasn't. It was sort of for your middling kind of Pākehā, and there was this resistance to letting Māori into that resource. But in the end, the sort of numbers became such that they couldn't. I mean, the Māori population doubled, went from 80 to I think 160,000 in like a 30-year period or something. And you can see these government departments just aren't prepared, and in fact are quite hostile to all these Māori turning up. And not only that, you had Pākehā families themselves there's these constant. There's a number of scholars refer to these. I'm only just starting into the primary sources, but complaints about Māori because they're Māori. These neighbours, do strange things like have a tangi in the garage or you have a boil up or something. It's like, what is that? And it was probably a whole lot of Pākehā people freaking out. What are these Māori moving in? And the pepper potting that Kim and others refer to. And so the reason I sort of sketched that out is because these youth aid, welfare officers and the like, that's the environment they're operating in. I think that period, and I don't want to broaden your scope because it's already big, but that whole economic background is huge, particularly that period, and that's where you see the escalation.
Kia ora, and I'm thinking of ex-nuptial births as well, and the impact on Māori women, which affects you directly, of course, right? So,
yeah.
Thank you for your evidence. I appreciate it. Kia ora.
I have no questions. Thank you for your evidence.
No, I just wanted to thank you for the forthrightness and the honesty in which you shared.
Kia ora, Erin. A couple of acknowledgements and a question. First, acknowledging that the people who have the survivors who have generously shared their stories with you, and acknowledging them, and they share at times with the Commission as well, and we seek for them to have justice from this as well. Secondly, you raised the issue of suicide amongst many survivors, and I think that is a big issue which we need to deal with as well, and acknowledging the many people passed as a result of abuse and care. Rata kia rata, tātou kia tātou. An observation, and I'm keen to get your take on that. There are lots of reports which nothing may have come from early on, but from my reading of a lot of documentation, there was almost no mention of sexual abuse up until about reports of the mid-80s or something like that, despite the evidence that we're hearing that it was endemic. Any thoughts, any comments, learnings from that?
I mean, Moana Jackson and I had this conversation. It's like, why is this stuff, coming out now? And I don't know that these. I think the social climate and having a name for it. I don't know that there was, much awareness of it at that time, whatever context it was happening in. I think there's also. This might seem a strange analogy, but I've interviewed war veterans, for example, and there's many of those old guys would not talk about what they'd experienced until later in life, and they had time to reflect, whether it's grandchildren or they knew their time was up. And I think there's a certain degree of that with survivors, and I think one aspect is. Actually, a friend in corrections mentioned this to me, that, for many of them, they don't really reflect. They charge it off, the abuse sort of sends their life off into this chaos. And then there gets a point at which they may have had kids, but they were kids themselves, and they don't have much interaction with those kids. And then it's not until they have mokopuna, grandchildren, that the bit of age and bit of wisdom kicks in. And they start to think about and reflect on their grandkids and the thought of their grandkids going through that. And that can be sometimes, I think, one trigger for people to talk. I never got to meet this person, but after I think it was my first story went out, the Human Rights Commission picked up a lot of the, people were calling into them, which I just actually like to acknowledge a couple of people, Susan Devoy and Christine Amundsen at the Human Rights Commission. They did a fantastic job of supporting, the people that came out in response to some of those stories. It was overwhelming, and it was certainly overwhelming for me to try and, I just didn't have the ability, and they picked up the slack. But anyway, I can't remember, it might have been Susan mentioned to me that there was a woman who rang up and rang into them, and I think she was sort of seeking some kind of help, and what had happened is her husband had broken down and told her what had happened to him in terms of sexual abuse, and he'd never disclosed that to her. And like I say, I didn't meet that individual and I can't comment, but that's been one of the really, if there's one thing I will kind of, I don't know what the result of this Royal Commission is going to be, but if there's one thing I can say that perhaps I've helped, or maybe even you could even say achieved, is broken through some of that silence and giving people permission to talk about it. And they may come and speak to the Royal Commission, they may not. It might be that they just talk to their family. And one of the things that just blew me away with working with Tyrone is he's got 4 adult daughters, and they read my story, and that was the first time that they had known what he had been through. And that was just astonishing to me. And I suppose there's a certain logic to it. Why would you want to expose your children to that kind of thing? And I suppose now that they're adults, maybe, but that I just felt utterly kind of humbled by that somebody finds out something that's happened to their own father. From me, that stuff, yeah. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's just that silencing and that shaming is just huge. And I think perpetrators can be very manipulative. And the fear, there's certain people that I'm dealing with, that I'm trying to talk to, who there's a fear. I'm trying to, it comes, I think I made it the statement earlier, it's trying to convince them that they're actually worthy to be heard. And that's, I'd consider that probably one of the most important things I do, or try to do.
That seems to me to be a helpful note, which might suitably bring our proceedings for today to an end, and to conclude the evidence that you have given, Mr. Smale. Can I join my colleagues in thanking you for the prodigious work that you have committed yourself to for a great many years, which provides the landscape on which the Royal Commission is tasked with its work.